Okay, we'll begin. So today we're going to consider the circular flow of income model. We're going to kind of step back and look at measuring economic performance. And this is like where we're going to finish up. We're going to finish up at this stage here. So this looks quite complicated. What we're going to do is just sort of add different elements of the economy until we start to get a picture of what it is we're measuring when we look at the economy. So the CSO collect the economic statistics, the main economic statistics in Ireland. And the statistics they collect from the point of view of the economy are largely based on the circular flow, tracking the flows in an economy, levels of output, levels of expenditure, levels of income, levels of saving. So what is happening in an economy? So we can step back and sort of make it a bit simpler. So although we have our four key players laid out here, so the household sector, the financial sector, the government sector, and the business sector. So they're the key areas in the economy. And the important issue is how they link together. What are the flows between them? So to start, we'll just look at the most basic description of the economy, which is the interaction between households and firms, the interaction between individuals and businesses, and the flow. So in the graph, the flow is in clockwise direction. So money is flowing in a clockwise direction. So although we've no arrows, you can take it here that we're going in a clockwise direction. So we have interaction between households and firms. The first loop we'll consider is what happens down at the bottom, the lower end, which takes place in factor markets, where the factors are the factors of production: land, labour, capital, and enterprise. So these are the things firms need to engage in production. And firms get these from households. Somebody owns the land. Somebody provides the labour. Somebody has saved the money. Or somebody provides the organisation or the idea. So firms get the land, labour, capital, enterprise from households. And for these factors, firms make payments. So you have income, rents, interest, and profits. So income on labour, rent on land, interest on capital, and profits for enterprise. So it's the first flow. It's a flow from firms to households. And these four flows, income, rents, interest, and profits, are what can be termed national income. So the factors of production are made available to firms in return for the payment of rent, wages, interest, and profit. So the sum of these four equals national income. So then if we look at the loop at the top, what occurs once the households have this money? To a large part, if we just limit it to the interaction between households and firms, households will spend that money. So it will fund household consumption, and this will take place in product markets. So whatever the firms have produced. So in this instance, we're not too concerned with what the firms do with the land, labour, capital, enterprise. But we assume they combine them in some black box operation that leads to production. So goods are produced, and households then purchase those goods with the national income they've earned by providing the factors of production. So this money then flows into firms as revenue. So this is the essence of the circular flow. Money flowing around from one sector of the economy to the other. Firms demanding the factors of production from households. Households demanding goods and services from firms. And the money flows around in this fashion here. So that at its simplest would be the circular flow of income. So GDP then is the total amount of goods and services produced in the economy. So when the firms combine the factors of production, what's the total value of the output they make? And that is measured then using GDP, gross domestic product. So it's a measure of economic activity, how much goods and services is made within the economy. So given in this simple version here, the only thing that can happen in this version here with households is that they spend their money on goods and services. So in this instance, GDP is equal to C in this very simple version. So household expenditure is private consumption expenditure, and given that the two loops are set equal and expenditure equals output, GDP is equal to C. So if you wanted to measure GDP in this simple version, you just add up consumption. What goods and services are purchased by households? So that's the first element of GDP, household consumption, which is largely funded through, or in this instance, completely funded through national income. What factors of production do households provide for firms? So to that then we can begin to add the impact of other sectors. The first one we'll add actually is the financial sector. The impact this has on the flows between households and firms. Not all money that households get has to be spent. So household consumption doesn't have to exhaust the full amount of household income. Households have a choice of what they can do. They can consume and go to product markets, or they can save and put the money into the financial sector. So this here is a flow from households to the financial sector, a flow of savings. So the choice with income is to spend it or to save it. And when looking for the definition of savings from our perspective, it's just money that's not spent. It doesn't really matter how the household gets the money from themselves into the financial sector. It could go into the deposit account, it could go into a pension fund, it could go into an investment, it could go to pay down debt. That would all be classified as saving, regardless of whether it's going into a traditional deposit account. As long as it's simply money that's not spent, it's classed as savings. And of course, for households, their consumption expenditure isn't limited by what they earn. There may be times when household consumption will exceed the flows in of income, rents, interest and profits, that they actually want to spend more, that their resources are limited and they want to either have a large expenditure on an item such as a house, or maybe a short-run expenditure coming up to a particular time of year, that they need to supplement their income with borrowings. So if savings flow from households into the financial sector, we can also get money flowing in the opposite direction. So debt is a flow from the financial sector into households. And this, in a sense, supplements household income. It can be a good thing. In many cases, as we've seen in Ireland over the last number of years, the problem was that too much consumption was funded by debt. That we went through a bit of a credit splurge between around 2004 and 2008, where private sector credit increased at alarming rates, and the consumption we were undertaking wasn't really based on fundamentals, on national income, rents, interest and profits. And of course, even the income itself was perhaps not based on fundamentals, as a lot of it came from the property and construction market. So this all flows into households. So households save, and they also then use debt to draw down investment. So the flow of savings reflects the fact that households do not spend all of their income. So some proportion of income is saved. So savings represents a leakage from the circular flow. So the circular flow is money flowing out on the outside here. If a household gets money and saves it, well, it's gone into the financial sector. It's no longer flowing around the economy. So in fact, too high a savings rate can lead to too much money being extracted from the circular flow. And in Ireland at the moment, our savings rate is about 12%. 12% of household disposable income is saved, which seems quite remarkable given that we're in the depths of a quite deep recession. But again, note that what savings is, it's not just simply money going into deposit accounts. Savings is income not spent. If we went through a credit boom as we did for 4 or 5 years in the middle of the last decade, we're now going through a very steep deleveraging process where households are paying back the debt they built up during the boom years. So at the end of 2008, households had outstanding loans of 203 billion. So over the previous number of years, most of that was built up. So households owed 203 billion at the end of 2008. The most recent data from the central bank puts that at 185 billion. That's for the first quarter of 2011. So in just 2.5 years, household debt has fallen from 203 billion to 185 billion. And that is the primary reason why our savings rate is so high at 12%. It's not that we're building up huge accumulation of deposits. The money isn't going into the traditional concept of saving. The money is going to pay down debt. So we supplemented our consumption in the good times by borrowing hugely. And in fact, now when we need consumers to be spending, when there's a downturn in the economy and we need increased economic activity, more and more income is going to pay down debt. It's flowing into the financial sector. And the financial sector has its own problems. Not only are households deleveraging where they are paid down debt, the financial sector is doing something similar. During the boom, the financial sector dished out too many loans. There should be a link between the deposits a bank has and the amount of loans it issues. The banks just can't create money. There has to be a link between the deposits and the loans they have on their books. But what happened during the boom was that loans were growing at a far faster rate than deposits. So the banks were actually dependent on funding from abroad, dependent on funding from these bondholders to fund the loans they were issuing. That they were moving more and more away from a basis where the loans were funded by customer deposits to a stage where the loans were funded by financial markets. And as we've seen over the last 2 to 3 years, financial markets can dry up and become sticky very quickly, that where banks stop lending to each other. So a huge amount of the debt created in Ireland was based on money from abroad. And in the run-up to the end of September 2008, this was the key problem the banks faced. There was a huge lack of trust of the Irish banks, and other banks wouldn't lend to them. So this was the argument in September 2008, that the banks had a liquidity problem. Nobody would lend to them. Of course, the key issue was to figure out why nobody would lend to them. That not only did they have a liquidity problem, but they also had a solvency problem. That there was a complete lack of trust. So what's happening in the financial sector at the moment is that savings are quite large, and these are taken from consumption, but new loans are quite small. The financial sector is getting their loan-to-deposit ratio back down. In 2008, it was about 180%. For every €100 the banks had on deposit, they had loans outstanding of €180. So they were taking in €100 from their customers, and they were lending out €180. So there was a big difference between what was happening. And this was providing the boost to the economy. If you look at savings, savings is a leakage. So €100 was coming out in the form of savings. The creation of debt is an inflow. So for every €100 that was going out, €180 was coming in. And this was, in a sense, providing a stimulus for the overall economy. Now what's happening is the banks have to deleverage. They have to get their loan-to-deposit ratios down to 120%. So this is part of the restructuring process of the Irish economy. It's part of the recapitalisation that the banks are going through. That not only are households deleveraging, the financial sector will deleverage and get their loan-to-deposit ratio down to 120%. So what this means is that for every €100 they take in, they're lending 120. But that's once they get the ratio to that level. At the moment, they're hugely distant from that ratio. So at the moment now, the banks are essentially hungry for deposits, looking to take in savings, and looking to issue out no new loans. New lending to the Irish economy is virtually ground to a standstill, be it consumer lending, mortgage lending, or business lending. There is a substantial drop in lending into the Irish economy. And this is sort of part of the reason why the circular flow, the measure of GDP, if we look at what's happening out here, has contracted so rapidly. that credit has essentially dried up because of the huge problems and the balance sheet of the banks. So both the households and the financial sector have balance sheet problems as a result of the excesses of the boom. Back in the boom, the households weren't saving too much. Back in 2007, our savings rate was 1%. So of net disposable income, we were saving 1%, a tiny amount. Now in 2011, in the midst of a recession, our savings rate is 12%. And again, it's not because people are putting huge amounts of money on deposit. So from time to time, you'll hear certain arms of the government suggesting if we could get consumers back spending again, the economy would take off. Consumers are the largest part of the economy, but their savings rate of 12% isn't because they're putting huge amounts of money away for the rainy day. If you look at deposits in Ireland, savings of households in Ireland, they're wholly relatively stable. So I would imagine there's a certain proportion of the economy drawing down their savings, those who have lost their job, those who have suffered a drop in income, and then there's a certain proportion of the economy increasing their savings. But on average, they're about balancing out. Deposits are remaining close to zero. Where the savings is going is to pay down debt. And in general, in an economy, what you want is a flow here. Money going from households who have an excess, who can save it, into the financial sector, and then households who want to borrow it, being allowed to create that debt. So either through house purchases, consumer purchases, car purchases, or investment in businesses, that the sources of credit are available, that you have a flow from those who have an excess to those who want the funds. So the money flows from one part of the economy to the other. You also have a link between the financial sector and firms. So not only does the savings of households fund the debt creation of households, if firms want investment, they look to the financial sector. So firms have a whole host of different ways of raising funds. So it could be that firms want to issue bonds themselves. It could be that firms want to issue shares. When it comes to it, bonds and shares are owned by individuals. So there may be talk of speculators, gamblers, etc. in financial markets. But the money from the financial sector can only come from individuals. Individuals are the only things that can own something. It might be owned by a company, but that company is itself owned by somebody else. The key actors in any economy are the individuals. Somebody very anxious to talk to me. The key actors in an economy are individuals. So again, when firms are looking for investment, the intermediary is the financial sector. Households save the money. Households can buy shares in companies, buy bonds from companies, invest directly in companies, and it flows from the financial sector to firms. When we look for the government sector, we can see the government can also have a necessity for money. And again, people talk about bondholders. At the essence of it, it is individuals. The money must come from savings. If somebody is going to own a debt instrument like a bond, there has to be some of their income that they didn't spend. They earned a particular amount of income, didn't spend it, they saved it, put it into the financial sector, could either come back in the form of loans to households, or it could be in direct investment in government bonds or in business investment. So the financial sector has an important role to play, particularly once it runs smoothly. It tends to go unseen, that the wheels are greased and the money is flowing around. What's happened for the last 3 to 4 years has been a credit crunch. The wheels have gummed up. The money isn't flowing around as it should. That there's a certain lack of confidence in the entire system to operate, and that maybe some of the transactions that were occurring in here weren't as valuable as some made them out to be. That one of the issues households have is knowing what exactly is taking place in the financial sector. It tends to be sort of very complicated, very opaque, very high level, that individuals are contributing the money to the financial sector and maybe not too sure of what's going on. What are they purchasing? What's available? So there's been a whole host of products created over the past 10, 15 years. To a certain extent, a lot of the issue in the financial market is generating activity. If you are somebody who sells financial products, you want activity. You want to be taking your a quarter or a half or even 1% of each transaction. So by generating more complicated financial products, Some suggest that the hope has just been to generate activity rather than actually adding value. So some complicated products that have generated much of the interest over the last number of years has involved just packaging products together, such as mortgages and collateralized debt obligations. Collateralized, where you just simply put something together. So if you wanted to buy a bond, you could buy a government bond, or you could buy a bond from a company. There was also bonds created from mortgages, where rather than the government paying interest or the firm paying interest, it was households paying interest. But given the size of one mortgage, there isn't really any point in trying to sell one mortgage. Like you're only selling a couple of 100,000 at a time. So what a lot of companies did was bundled mortgage together, put thousands, tens of thousands of mortgages together, and suddenly you're dealing with a product that's worth hundreds of millions and billions. What you do then is you collect all the interest from the individuals and then pay it to those who invested in these collateralized debt obligations. That rather than getting it from 10,000 households, the bank collected the money and then it fed up through the system. The problem, of course, was that if you're going to invest in these, you can't keep track of 10,000 householders. How do you know they're going to pay? How do you know the interest is going to flow through the system from the homeowners, to the bank, to the investment house, to the person who owns the collateralized debt obligation? So households need assistance. And one area you can look to for assistance are rating agencies. Let them go off and check these products. Let them put their reputation on the line and tell individuals the quality or otherwise of the products. So the rating agencies looked at these collateralized debt obligations of mortgages and gave them the top rating, AAA rating. There is no chance of default on this debt obligation. You will get your money back. Of course, the issue is that when the rating agencies were looking at it, they looked at the probability of default on a mortgage, but they looked at it individually. What is the likelihood that this family will default? What is the likelihood that this family will default? And they found that individually, all the probabilities were quite low. That if you look at households, in the greater majority of cases, the odds of them repaying their mortgage are quite high. So there could be a 95% chance, 96% chance of repayment. And you say, sure, if you look at this, only a couple of mortgages are going to default, the vast majority will repay, this product is going to generate a return. The problem was, of course, that even if the households only have a 5% chance of default, given the way the economy operates, that 5% chance of default is correlated across all households. Those who were going to default, defaulted at the same time. With the downturn in the economy in 2007, 2008. So even though individually they all had a small chance of default, collectively, of course, it all happened together. The 1 in 20 chance wasn't just one mortgage in 20 defaulting. It was all the mortgages were going to default at the same time. So the collateralized debt obligations turned out to be worth far less than they turned out to be, and substantial sums of money were lost. And sort of the subprime crisis from 2007 was sort of the initial event that caused a gumming up of the financial sector, this so-called credit crunch, where the money wasn't flowing around to the different sectors of the economy, where now there was a greater level of distrust, where people couldn't believe what was being said by rating agencies, by investment houses, by other elements of the financial sector, and the money was essentially getting trapped inside here. And that's been a problem ever since. If you're watching the news yesterday, you'll note that the UK are going printing money. The UK are undertaking what's called quantitative easing. The problem the UK are looking at is that there isn't enough money flowing around here on the outside. They're saying there's a lack of money out here. And the problem is that most of it is stuck in here, in the financial sector. So what Mervyn King has suggested he'll do is he's going to print 75 billion sterling. Okay, he's not physically going to go to the Royal Mint and print 75 billion notes. But what he's going to do is create money, electronic money, and buy debt instruments in the financial sector. So the financial sector holds bonds from government, it holds bonds from firms, and through mortgages it might hold bonds from households. So what Mervyn King is going to do is going to buy 75 billion worth of those. Of course, Mervyn King doesn't have 75 billion, but he's the one person in the UK who doesn't need it. He can just create the money. So he'll go to a bank and say, look, I'll buy 5 billion worth of stuff from you. And he'll just transfer 5 billion from the Bank of England across to that bank. So he's putting the money in here with the hope that will flow out through investment and flow out through debt. That if you put more cash in here, you'll get more flowing around on the outside. This isn't the first time the UK have done it. They've already printed 220 billion sterling. It got stuck in the balance sheet of the banks. The banks were such a mess that when they sold the bonds that they held, they didn't lend the money. They're a bit like the Irish banks trying to get their own balance sheets in order and said, look, here's a situation where we can get a relatively risky asset, a government bond worth 100 million, and get 100 million in cash off Mervyn King. Our balance sheet will look a bit better with 100 million of cash than with 100 million of a government bond, particularly if it's an Irish government bond, a Portuguese government bond, or a Greek government bond. Let's give that to Mervyn. No, he can worry about that. Let's keep the cash in our balance sheet. So quantitative easing is trying to get money from here out to the outside. The US has gone through 2 bouts of quantitative easing. Over in the US, Ben Bernanke has done it twice. Basically magic money out of nothing. And again, the evidence in the US suggests that it's not getting out of the financial sector. That what the banks are doing is using it to improve their balance sheets. That in the credit fuel boom of the last decade, they issued billions of dodgy loans and bank balance sheets are under pressure. So rather than offering private debt or private investment or borrowings to government, what the banks are doing is just holding on to the money. So the argument that was made in the UK yesterday was that they didn't go far enough. The 220 billion in the first 2 rounds of QE wasn't enough. They were going to go for another 75 billion for QE3. Whether it'll work or not is hard to know. One impact of all this money creation is that if the supply of a particular good goes up, its price goes down. If something is in huge supply, its price will go down. And the price of money, the value of money, it's its purchasing power. If the price of money goes down, inflation will go up. Inflation at the moment in the UK is 5%. So there was an interview with Mervyn King last night who said he believes inflation has now peaked and that this, in a sense, justifies his role of adding 75 billion to the economy. That it's not going to fuel inflationary pressures, as in drive prices up. So there have been a number of instances of the problems of quantitative easing. At its most extreme in the last number of years, you just go to Zimbabwe, where they were issuing $100 trillion notes. Robert Mugabe has 5 degrees in economics. I think that's more than Mervyn King, so can we trust Mervyn King to get it right? So will he be able to take the money out of the system? So will Mervyn King be able to sell all these bonds he's after buying when the economy has picked up? So the theory is that in the good time, then you take the money supply back out. So Mervyn King has all these bonds in the balance sheets of the Bank of England. He then sells them. He doesn't really care who buys them. He's just taking the cash he created back, and he puts the money he created back into a drawer or something. It just disappears again. So that is the theory. Whether it'll work is hard to know. In the UK, they're going for 300 billion of quantitative easing. In the US, they're over $1 trillion already. $1,000 billion created. And up to now, the suggestion is that the effect of it isn't really that large. So that's the financial sector. It is supposed to take the excess income that households earn and distribute it across the economy where it's supposed to serve a useful purpose. As it stands at the moment, the financial sector is where a lot of the problems lie. That money is, in a sense, getting tied up in this sector and not flowing across. And of course, the financial sector being relatively opaque, it's quite hard to determine what's taking place. And one issue that needs to be resolved once and for all is the level of losses that are in there. What level of dodgy loans has the financial sector dished out? So we know that the financial sector has given bonds to governments that won't pay back. Greece isn't going to pay back all the money it owes. So somebody is going to have to take that hit. In Ireland, to the private sector, the banks issued huge amounts of dodgy loans to developers and to other investors and even to individuals, to mortgages that won't be paid back. So what losses are going to be picked up inside here? And then there are a huge number of firms who have taken money that are going to go insolvent and go closed. Again, the money won't be paid back. The issue is that if all these are flows of debt out, it's households. Somebody has to take the cost at some stage. That households have provided the money to fund what's happening in the financial sector. If the financial sector is making losses, these losses must come back to households. So there are huge doubts about the losses in the financial sector, given the way the accounting techniques are undertaken and the fact that when do you actually realise a loss? Like if you have a mortgage in a bank that's 12 months in arrears, like how much do you value that mortgage at? That household could owe you €200,000. For the bank, that's an asset. They said this household is going to pay us €200,000 plus interest. That mortgage could be 12 months in arrears. 12 months, a year behind on their payments, and still on the balance sheet of the bank it'll be valued at €200,000. When do they come to the realisation that this money isn't going to come back in? When is the loss actually realised, and what is the level of the losses? In Ireland, we've pumped 63 billion into the banks to recapitalise them, to cover some of these losses. During the summer, every bank in Europe did a stress test under a European banking system, and the total recapitalisation bill for all banks in Europe was estimated at 2 billion. We put 63 billion into our banks to cover losses. So a stress test of European banks said they need 2 billion. I can be pretty sure there wasn't too many people who believed those. If you look at banking shares over the summer, they're the ones that are taking the heaviest losses. French banks down almost 50%. A Belgian bank in the week, Dexia, pretty much close to collapse in a comparable way to the Anglo-Irish bank over here. So the realisation, the losses that's taking place here is quite low. So there are some who suggest that European banks need 100 to 200 billion. So that even puts the Irish bailout into context. We put 63 billion into our banks, and we're just a small part of Europe. So our banks were complete disaster zones altogether. But even like who is going to provide the 100 to 200 billion to recapitalise European banks? Where do the losses lie? The losses have to end up somewhere with an individual. Individuals have to carry the loss. The issue is, who are the individuals that carry the loss? Is it deposit holders? Do the banks say, look, we can't pay back deposits? There's hundreds of billions on bank deposit throughout the European system. Is it bondholders? Those who didn't put money on deposit would look for a slightly higher rate of return by buying bonds from governments. Or has been generally the case in Ireland, is it taxpayers? But when it boils down to it, it'll be households, individuals who carry the losses. The issue is making the choice between them. Do you go for depositors, bondholders, or taxpayers? Up to now, much of the focus has been on taxpayers carrying the loss. There has been some losses for bondholders, typically those which are called junior bondholders, those who are at the bottom of the queue, that if a business is under pressure, junior or subordinated bondholders rank lower. But senior bondholders and depositors have got all their money back so far. No depositor has lost any money in Irish banks, and also no senior bondholder has lost any money in Irish banks. So there is a big issue about this financial sector, and these problems are gumming up the whole system, getting the money flowing from one part of the economy to the other. The next player we'll look at in the economy is the government, and governments themselves have their own problems. So in the circular flow, the issue with government is the impact it has on the flows that create or combine to make GDP. So here we have 4 flows in and out of government. So the taxes are flows into government. So sales taxes. So the government takes a proportion of the amount of money households spend on consumption. All that money doesn't go on goods and services. Some of the money households spend actually goes to the government. So in Ireland we have VAT and excise duty. And then all the money that firms pay for the factors of production, that doesn't flow to households. So if you earn an income, earn a rent, earn interest, or earn a profit, there will be a factor tax. So that's a tax on the income of the factors of production. So all the money that flows from firms doesn't get to households. A certain proportion is taken in factor taxes. And all the money that households spend doesn't go on consumption. A certain amount goes in sales taxes. So these are the revenues of government. So in Ireland, the sales taxes are VAT and excise duty. And the factor taxes are income tax, you've dirt, you've corporate income tax, and other selective factor taxes. So income tax, dirt, deposit interest, retention tax, and the corporation tax. There are suggestions that the government should start collecting money from the financial sector. So over the last week or so, there has been suggestions of a financial transactions tax, that all the stuff that's happening inside here, that a tax should also be flowing to the government. The so-called Tobin tax, named after James Tobin, who first devised or suggested it back in the 1960s. But at present, there isn't a financial transactions tax per se. There are some taxes that are based in the financial sector, but it's largely households that pay them, but they come through the financial sector. So these would be the transaction taxes, stamp duty when you buy an asset, capital gains tax when you sell an asset, or capital acquisitions tax when you get an asset. So these are based on the financial sector. They're based on transactions, and they generally come from households. What the Tobin tax is looking at, financial transactions within the financial sector. So transactions between banks, between insurance companies, where the suggestion is that because of the quest for activity, too many of these transactions are taking place and too high a risk is being undertaken. So at present, most taxes come from households, and you could look at the transaction taxes as a class of sales taxes. So the government collects revenue from taxes. The government then spends that money. So we have two inflows into the circular flow from government. The demand that firms face doesn't necessarily have to come from households. The only market for firms is in households. Firms can also sell to government. So government expenditure on goods and services, government expenditure on construction, on electricity, on gas, on stationery, on products, on cars, whatever it is the government purchases, feeds into demand. So it doesn't necessarily come from households. And then for the government, that can also support incomes. So some government expenditure isn't for goods and services. Some government expenditure is just a transfer. Give money to people. So household income isn't entirely dependent on what you earn. In most countries, there's a fairly substantial social welfare system, so that those who don't earn money from income, rents, interest, or profit have some level of income. So you have a system of transfer payments. So that's the government supporting income into households. So be it unemployment benefit, pensions, disability benefit, single parents allowance, child benefit, whatever it might be. So in Ireland, there are substantial payments made through the tax system. If the government is balancing its books, well, the impact of the government on the financial sector isn't that significant. But if the government actually is in need of borrowing, again, that must come from the financial sector. And in Ireland, we've been shut out from financial markets. Our financial sector had doubts about the Irish government's ability to repay. So this flow from the financial sector to the Irish government dried up, simply because they couldn't see the money coming back. Doubts about the ability of the Irish government to close the budget deficit, and in particular doubts about what was happening in the financial sector. You've committed 63 billion to the Irish banks. Will you need to commit more? How much of that will you get back? So this all led to doubts about investment in the sovereign in Ireland. So with a deficit, the government turns to financial markets. The third sector we'll add is the external sector. And this is relatively straightforward to appreciate. And this is the final element of the economy. That again, households don't have to spend all their money buying from domestic firms. You can buy goods or services from any country. And this was forcibly proved in the UK during the week with the court case to the European Court of Justice of the pub landlady in Portsmouth who'd purchased rights to Premiership television from a Greek television company. And the European Court of Justice says, well, that's perfectly okay. It's an open market. You're free to purchase from anywhere within the market. There might be some copyright issues, but buying a television signal from a Greek company is entirely legal. So consumers can spend their money on imports. So instead of the money flowing to Rupert Murdoch and B Sky B, although I'm sure some of it was coming back, it was flowing to some Greek television company, possibly state-owned. So households can spend on imports, and this is a leakage from the circular flow. This isn't money flowing around the domestic economy. This is money going to flow around an economy somewhere else. So in Ireland we've had periodic instances where there's been importance placed on the role of imports, the fact that it's a leakage out of the economy. So back 20, 30 years ago, particularly in the 1980s, there have been campaigns like Buy Irish, Guaranteed Irish, because if you buy off a domestic firm, the money can stay within the domestic economy and flow around the domestic economy. This has been sort of less of an issue in recent times because you also have an inflow into the circular flow. That firms in Ireland aren't dependent on Irish households for their revenue. Firms can also sell abroad. So exports is money coming into the circular flow. So if you can sell goods abroad, that's actually money coming into the economy. And we have huge exports from Ireland. Exports are more than 100% of GDP. Imports are quite large as well. So the level of trade taking place from this leakage and this inflow are substantial. The foreign sector also has a role to play when it comes to the profits the firms make, particularly if the firms aren't Irish-based or Irish-owned. If they're foreign firms where the investment came in from abroad. So we said the firms dependent on the financial sector. As I said, in Ireland we sort of have a history of a lack of capital investment, that under our inward orientation, self-sufficiency regime for the first 40 or 50 years, there was very little investment because the money wasn't available in the domestic economy. One alternative is to get it from the external economy, to attract foreign direct investment. So this is an inflow. So it means your investment isn't dependent on domestic savings. But if the money isn't there, if you don't have the money, where does the investment come from? Well, try to attract it from abroad. But one issue with the level of foreign direct investment is that while huge profits might be made from exports, a lot of that profit tends to repatriate abroad. So this is an outflow. So this is about 22 billion a quarter, 80 billion a year flowing out. So the large multinationals that are set up in Ireland have operated in Ireland, earned their profits, but their shareholders aren't Irish households. Their profits aren't flowing to their Irish households because Irish households don't own the shares. They're US or European or owned elsewhere. So the profits go to where the shareholders are. So they're repatriated abroad. Of course, Irish households can own shares abroad. And in fact, we do own substantial shares abroad. So profits can come from abroad. They were not simply entirely dependent on what happens in the Irish economy for flows in. And repatriated profits into Ireland are quite large. The net of factor income is about minus 30 billion. So if 80 billion flowed out, 50 billion flowed in. So the balance is minus 30. So while people talk of net factor income from abroad flowing out of Ireland, it actually is the balance. There is substantial amounts flowing in, but it's completely countered by what's flowing out. And the final element of the foreign sector to add is again a leakage in the Irish case, because foreign transfers are now negative. It's where the government doesn't just give money to Irish households, it gives money to foreigners. So whether it's a contribution to the EU budget that the EU might be spending abroad, or whether it's our foreign aid budget, close on 800 million going for projects in the developing and third world. So this is government expenditure. That's an outflow from the circular flow. So these give us the key elements that the CSO measures. So GDP is consumption plus government expenditure plus investment and then net exports. So GDP is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So GDP is C plus I plus G. That's consumption plus investment plus government plus exports, which add to the circular flow. And from that then you subtract imports. And that's what the CSO measure. To get GNP then, how much of that is actually flowing into Irish households? So GDP is the total value of goods and services produced. So that gives you the money flowing around the circular flow. GNP then is GDP minus net factor income from abroad. So look at the profits flowing out of the country, the profits flowing in. What is the balance of those two? So GDP is a measure of the activity, the consumption, the investment, the government expenditure, the exports and the imports. And GNP is a measure of the income. How much of that activity actually leads to income of Irish households? And in Ireland, there's over a 20% gap between GDP and GNP. So you have to be careful when looking at macroeconomic aggregates in Ireland. Is somebody quoting GDP? Well, that's the size of the Irish economy. Is somebody quoting GNP? Well, that's the earnings of Irish households. There is an important distinction between the two, and the gap is about 30 billion. So it is quite large. So this is what the CSO measures with help from government departments, the central bank, and other areas when they look at the circular flow. And it's patterns of these data that have attracted a lot of attention in recent times. So we'll leave it at that for this week. That concludes our introduction. The course, and from next week we'll be taking it up with topic 2.